All right, greetings everybody. Thanks to John and the organizers for actually putting Yana and my talk back to back, because actually they dovetail extremely well together. You just heard sort of a legal perspective on dark sky legislation. I'm a professional astronomer, so you'll hear now more of an astronomical take on it. I also am going to take a little bit of a global thing, but also one last bit. There's a really cool program in the US that allows scientists to actually participate in the legislative process. So I had a year as a staffer in the US Senate where I actually got to see how the sausage is made and what it actually takes to get a law done about whether it be dark skies or anything else. And there's a reason it's sausage. It's just as messy as it sounds and seems. So onwards. So what I was part of for the past 2 years is something that you'll hear about more from Connie Walker when she talks about the International Astronomical Union's Center on the Protection for the Dark and Quiet Skies, the IACPS. It's actually broken down into a whole bunch of different subgroups. I was part of what's called the Policy Hub, and in particular Work Package 2. We come up with really clever names for things. And what Work Package 2 was working on was all of these sort of regulatory and policy viewpoints for dark skies. There was a group of people working on international analyses, looking at the Outer Space Treaty, the work of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and thinking about how those hooks provide ways of arguing both for dark skies on Earth, but also for dark skies in space. Satellite constellations are increasingly a problem, especially for professional astronomers, but for amateur astronomers as well. And I think people have increasingly seen all these streaks going by. There was another group, which is the group that I spent most of my time in, that was working on national analyses, going to all of the countries that are members of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and looking to see what was buried either in their policies, in their laws, wherever we could find hooks that would seem to apply towards the protection of the dark and quiet skies. And then finally, as came up in our previous session, there was also a team looking at the indigenous perspective of the protection of the dark and quiet skies. This group involved astronomers, lawyers, historians, policymakers, social scientists, because it really takes a broad view of people to really dig in and think about this issue and come up with some interesting observations. So, onwards. I should mention, of course, that this was a large group of people. Yeah?
Sorry, I'm pretty Mr.
So now we're talking louder.
I am a big voice.
So anyway, this is a group of 14 people who are doing the national analyses. You see Yana's name on there, my name. But this couldn't have been done without this large group of people, because I should say there's an awful lot of countries out there in the world, and let's say people who write laws don't tend to write succinctly, they write very voluminously. And so digging through all of this material to try to find what they're doing, to make matters worse, they tend to use the languages that they use in their own country, which I appreciate. So people who spoke and were fluent in these various languages would be assigned to the appropriate countries to have a better chance of actually figuring out what was going on in that country's legal system. So all told, we ended up analyzing 77 different countries scattered across the globe. Most of this, as I said, is countries that are actively involved on COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So if you see a country that's grayed out, you should, and you know people there, should get them involved in the United Nations activities, and then we'll be happy to analyze them as well. So looking at them, as Yana already pointed out, there are some similarities as you look at these various national laws. This dovetails very nicely with what she had. There are just a few, but I'll mention them here in a moment, that actually talk about it as an astronomical thing that's being protected. That's actually pretty rare. Most places don't think of it that way. Instead, they come at it either from the light pollution perspective, which drives up from energy, as Yana already said, of energy conservation, or they come at it from an environmental pollution aspect, where it's a pollutant just like air pollution or sound pollution, light pollution being just yet another kind of pollution. And then there's a whole set of countries that do it piecemeal. So they, for instance, we're in the Mackenzie Dark Sky Reserve, so there's a regional restriction, but it's not national. So I was trying to focus on things that were national in scope, but I'll mention at least the ones that have some of these regional protections in place, which are very valuable, but also very localized. So let's do first the ones that mention astronomy in particular. I should mention this, all of these things I'm trying to condense 77 countries, and we wrote 173 pages of material about those 77 countries, and now I'm trying to reduce this to a Boolean, yes, no, and so all of these Booleans are very fuzzy, so you may think that someone does astronomy or not, you can forgive me on that. In any case, only a few countries actually explicitly mention astronomy in a national level law describing what's happening with regards to light pollution. So out of 77, 5. So if you're looking for best practices for laws that mention astronomy, there aren't very many, and it's not something that tends to resonate with a lot of governments as something that they should explicitly write about. So let's instead go to something, well, let's actually look first at a country that does. So there was a question previously about Chile. So this is actually Chile's most recent law, just as recently as October 2023. Chile previously had a law that just affected the north part of Chile. Turns out most of these big professional observatories, whether it be Gemini or whether it be ALMA, which is in the radio, or ESO's observatory, the very large telescope, they tend to be mostly in the northern part of the country. And so Atacama, Antofagasta, and Coquimbo were the areas that were covered, but Chile decided this was a good thing. We're going to cover all of Chile with this law. And so just recently they've expanded the scope. It has some new technical requirements for what light protection is required across the entire country. But also, you notice this environmental hook is important. Biodiversity and human health is always going to be a thread in all of these laws. So, you ask, do they actually follow these laws? Well, I had the opportunity to visit one of the Chilean observatories, and they were complaining vociferously about a highway that had recently been built down at the bottom of the mountain, and the highway had this lovely rest plazas and these lovely illuminated lights, and so why did they do that? Well, you know, the contractor of the highway didn't really realize there was this law they were supposed to follow, and you know, they were having some back and forth. Obviously, the astronomers had noticed, and they were working on it, but it makes it clear that even when you have a law, it requires some effort to actually make sure it gets followed. And there's an office in Chile that tries to work through this, but it's always going to be an ongoing issue, even when you're in a country like Chile that is really prioritized, putting lots of effort into really top-notch astronomical observatories. Similarly, South Africa has a national level law, the Astronomy Geographic Advantage Act. This is another country that has really said that astronomy is really important to the entire economy. And so both for radio astronomy and optical astronomy, they're actively trying to protect specific, as they call them, astronomy advantage areas to make sure that things are kept clean for those telescopes that are in those areas. Onwards. So let's move on to more countries that have some more laws, light pollution laws. These tended to come up through the energy conservation end of things. You saw that Europe has a whole bunch of these, but it gets very scattered as you get out into the rest of the world, but they're out there. So I have 24 countries that I identified as having this type of national level light pollution style law. So let's look at one of them. So Spain is an example of one of these. Spain, of course, also has a set of telescopes they're trying to protect. So similarly, a specific law for the Canary Islands. But nationwide in Spain, there's both a law on air quality and protection of the atmosphere, but also this royal decree on energy efficiency in outdoor lighting installations. And so they're specifying what kinds of installations they're allowing, what types of luminaires, how much light, all of these things are being put in to try to restrain this in the Spanish world. And I mentioned the Spanish world because actually one of the things that's interesting about best practices is if you go to other Spanish-speaking countries, and so it turns out I speak Spanish, So I was looking at lots of Spanish laws, and also the documents that the legislators were using to create their laws. It turns out a lot of them were looking to Spain as being the exemplar for the laws that they wanted to copy. That they would literally go and say, okay, we're going to make sure we get section 3 and put that into our law. And so that is an example, if you can make a law that is broad scoped and that other countries can recognize as being a useful model, that can be very powerful. All right, onward. So Peru is an example of one of the countries that looked towards Spain's law. They were having huge trouble with these giant LED billboards, right? You know, imagine this huge billboard that's flashing these ever-changing colored lights right into the window of your apartment building. People were complaining. They weren't happy. And so in 2021, a law that specifically focused on LED billboards, but also lighting installations in general, was passed in Peru. But astrotourism is being worked on, even though it's not in the law. Places like Machu Picchu, the Nazca Lines are spectacular dark sky sites that people are going to and wanting to go to at night. And so there's efforts to extend some of these laws to cover astrotourism activities as well. So now let's go to the environmental pollution side of things. Now the world, funny people do like to not have polluted anything, polluted skies, polluted air, polluted light. So 52 countries identified as having environmental aspects to their light pollution laws. But it doesn't always work. So let's go to Colombia. Colombia, the right to access to a healthy environment is written into the Constitution. That seems like that should be a very strong thing for protecting the health of your citizens. To put it right in the Constitution, it doesn't actually work out so well. There are incredible complaints in Colombia about polluted light, polluted air, polluted everything. So, as Yana was pointing out, even if you put something strong in law, unless there's actually an enforcement mechanism, it doesn't do you that much good. All right, so let's go to some regional dark sky protections. Finally, some of these other places. The United States suffers from having 50 states, and so it has specific regulations scattered all over the place, but not so much at the national level. But there are lots of countries that have designated very specific regional areas as dark sky protection areas. And last but not least, this is probably an undercount because these things are all over the place. Efforts to protect dark skies are rampant. There are little groups, big groups, nationwide groups, all working to try to get their countries to do more about dark sky regulations. And so there's constantly opportunities in this front to interact with these groups in these various countries to try to extend the protections of dark skies. All right, so as I start wrapping up, let me point out some other issues, since I got 2 minutes left. It turns out these IUCPS is not just the protection of dark skies, but also the protection of quiet skies. So that means things like radio astronomy. There are lots of these localized radio quiet zones, but they tend to be right around a telescope, and someone goes wandering over the cell phone, zap. It turns out all of these technologies that we take for granted tend to use radio frequencies to communicate with each other. While many countries adopt ITU, the International Telecommunications Union guidelines, those are guidelines, and so actually making stricter things in that front is still an ongoing thing. People can see light, visible light, but people don't tend to think so much about the radio side of things. And then, of course, satellite constellations, and the picture speaks 1,000 words for satellite constellations. This is killing professional astronomy right now. The Rubin telescope, which will be done in a couple years, is just absolutely aghast at the streaks that are going to be going through it. And these are billions of dollars of taxpayer money that could possibly just be wasted because the sky is being filled up by commercial interests. And sadly, economic interests are pushing towards more satellites, not fewer. And now you get to a balance of social good. Satellites are really good for communications. Satellites are really good for emergency preparedness, for taking pictures of flooded zones. So balancing that with astronomy is a tricky thing to do, but it's something we need to think about. So my concluding slide, Since this is a talk in New Zealand to a New Zealand audience, and on the back of the program that John put together towards the first Dark Sky Nation, what might it take? Well, passing legislation is hard, as seen by the number of countries, but it's worthwhile. If you can get an enforcement mechanism, if you can make it actually stick, it's worth going for because it can make a really big difference in darkening the skies. But you can't just think about it from astronomy. It comes from coalitions. You need to gather groups. It's the environmental groups. It's the energy conservation side. You need to have a broad net of groups that you bring together because it's going to take lots of people coming together to make a law and make the dark sky, not just people who want to look at the stars themselves. And as we heard earlier today about things like surveys, building public interest and demand. If the public says, we want this, well, what is the legislature going to do but do it? So make people want it, and it will happen. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Nice presentation. Any questions for this one?
Hello, Brian Boyle here. I completely support your point about radio quiet legislation. It took 10 years of my life, 4 acts, 3 regulatory instruments and 4 policy instruments to get the Murchison radio astronomy radio quiet zone. Compared, I'm afraid, to the South African Astronomy Geographic Advantage Act, this is actually much stronger. The Geographic Advantage Act, because it's a national legislation, really only applies to specific areas, and you end up with a similar situation like Chile, and that nobody really cares in the end. So you have to balance the want to have national legislation with the buy-in that comes with regional protection.
I 100% agree. There are countries that are thinking about where you have to go to get radio quiet now. It's rapidly looking like you need to be on the far side of the moon. That's not a cheap place to go. It would actually be cheaper to quiet things down on the radio, but people like convenience. People like cell phones. People like these things. So yeah, radio, it's tough.
Thank you, Chris. Law means enforcement, means for penalty. Yeah. Could you introduce some penalty or regulation, the tough regulation about this country?
Yeah, so there aren't a lot. So most of them are, saying, so the Spanish example, right, they actively do things like reroute air traffic. So they don't allow overflights of planes to go over the Canary Islands because that would go through the telescope beams. But when I was reading through it, I don't recall that there's any fine, but they're working with the air traffic controllers to make it happen. So I think the places you tend to see active fines are when it's environmental, because usually those are wrapped into air pollution and water pollution, other sorts of things where there is a monetary penalty for violating it, and light pollution can get wrapped up in that same sort of regulatory framework. But usually light pollution on its own, it's a lighting standard to do energy conservation, and if you don't do it, you get your hand slapped, but it's not like they close your business.